episode 83 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian in my 14th year, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, by my interview guests, and by listeners who contact the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast is something for you. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to listeners Amy in Georgia, Tanya in Indiana, Tom in Missouri, and Anne in Pennsylvania. Anne tweeted out that I was now her virtual walking buddy. And while it would be wrong of me to promise everyone that you will lose weight while listening to this podcast, it is fair to say that Anne is very pleased with her results. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback, questions, and episode suggestions either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And now for today's episode, Role as Curator, and my interview with Amanda Jones. Listeners, I am so excited to be welcoming a good friend of mine to the podcast today. You know her and have probably seen some of her webinars, which she has so generously been posting during our pandemic. Amanda Jones, I cannot believe we're going to have this fourth episode. For listeners who have recently discovered the podcast, Amanda Jones has generously appeared on the podcast. This is now her fourth time. If you haven't listened to episode 41, Using Social Media to Showcase Your Library, episode 49, Free Money and How to Stretch Your Budget, and episode 72, OERs, I strongly encourage you to make time. Amanda is incredibly thorough and generous with all of her resources, and her show notes are incredibly in-depth. So thank you, Amanda, for making time for our conversation today.
Thank you for having me. I'll come on anytime you ever want me to.
I'll tell you, friends, the pre-show, the conversation Amanda and I had before this conversation, it really does remind me that the more the podcast connects with librarians around the country, the larger this listening community becomes. And it really is a source of support for me. I've talked to some of my guests who really find that their PLNs have grown, and the ability for all of us to support one another is made that much easier because we are following the model that Amanda in many cases has set, and that is to be as generous as we can with our fellow school librarians. I realized when preparing for our interview, most recently with OERs, we were going to need a follow-up episode. Your presentation with Rebecca Gerdes included a fascinating look at tech tools for curating. And with so many of us, and I'm going to say most of us, teaching remotely, this role is more important than ever.
Yes. In fact, ever since the school buildings closed and COVID, I've really realized that I needed to up my curating game. I really needed to work on it. So this one thing that's come out of this whole pandemic is that I've had time to reflect professionally, and curation has been something that I've been really working hard on.
I'm just going to say on a side, did you ever have a class on curation? I mean, we had classes, and this is what made me think of it. We had classes on collection development. And when I say collection development, and I'm that old, this was strictly a print collection we were talking about. And you and I both know that now it has expanded to be a digital collection because we have to be selective with those digital dollars that we have in our budget. But when we think about curation, to me, that's more about resources. And I never took a class on curating resources.
I didn't either. And my classes were about 22 years ago, my last library class I had, but no, never. We were still talking about print resources. I think we did talk a little bit about saving local history in a file cabinet, but we didn't talk like really curating resources. I don't remember it at all.
No. All right. Well, I hopefully we'll get some of these young librarians to chime in and say, oh, yeah, we totally learned about curation. I'm like, I need to go back to school. All right. So let's give credit where credit is due. Your partner in this effort, Rebecca Gerdes, how great that you can collaborate with other school librarians in your district.
She's in my neighboring district. So we aren't even in the same district, but her district, she's only like 15 miles from me. We both kind of live on the edge of the two districts. But Rebecca is amazing. She finds the coolest resources, especially STEM related. She's a kindergarten librarian, and she's very generous in sharing her STEM resources also.
Wow. And it's nice because you can balance some of the workload you take on the upper elementary. She can focus on the lower elementary.
Exactly.
It's a little yin and yang. That's very nice. So remind listeners a little bit about your school and where you teach.
So I teach at a 5th and 6th grade middle school called Live Oak Middle School in Watson, Louisiana. We're around 20 minutes outside of Baton Rouge, north of Baton Rouge, about an hour and a half from New Orleans. We are considered a suburban school, but we only have 2 red lights. It's not like we're that large. We're not even an incorporated town. So I still say we're rural. So we have about 700 5th and 6th grade students. So every child in our community will pass through our middle school. And I've been there. This is my 20th year, 14 years as an ELA teacher, and this will be my 6th year as teacher librarian.
All right. Fantastic. So for today's episode on our role as curator, would you please explain the difference between collecting resources and curating resources?
So my friend Rebecca Gerdes, she likes to say that collecting is what hoarders do. You just collect and collect and it piles up and you never go through it and you just collect, and it's just sometimes there's some good stuff in there and then sometimes there's some junk, but you're just going to throw everything together. Example would be like my Pinterest board is ridiculous. I just tag everything. You don't evaluate your sources all the time if you're a collector, but if you're a curator and you're curating, you tend to select high quality sources that you have validated where they have come from, and you tend to organize them with a purpose.
Well, and I like that this is sort of, I tend to think of it as we're sort of human filters. We are the filtering or the pre-screening before we send this information out to our intended recipients, be it our students at specific grade levels, be it our teachers, be it our district support or our PLN. We tend to be quality control for much of what gets sent out. I want to break down the components of curating because I think this is where our skills as information specialists come into play. The first part I see of curating is the selection process. Is this just a case of us being picky? I think of the word discriminating, and discriminating in that we are selective in a good way, that we are trying to be as, putting as much thought, as you said, into what we're doing. So could you speak a little bit to the selection process for you when you're curating?
So whenever I'm curating a resource, I always like to see, is this going to be beneficial? Is this really going to be needed? Or am I just throwing something together because I like it? Or is it going to be beneficial to the teachers or the students or whoever I'm curating for? I'll look to see if it's a reliable source. Who wrote the source? Where did it come from? Who's sharing it? If I found the information from someone else, I'll look and see, do I trust that person? So obviously if it's, AASL is sharing a resource, you can guarantee it's probably going to be good quality information. Same with like school library journal. So I like to look and see who the author is and who's sharing it. And then there are other librarians that I consider kind of like experts in their field. So I know that if I'm looking for advocacy and I see something that Casey Boyd has shared, I know it's going to be a quality advocacy source. If it's something on equity and Nancy Jo Lambert has shared it, I know it's going to be quality source. So I don't usually look too far into that because I'm like, well, if Nancy Jo shared it, it's going to be good.
Well, and I think that not only considering the source, but also considering the age of the information, because as I tell my students, the internet is a lot like outer space. You're going to just bump into garbage. You're going to bump into space junk that just gets pushed out. And I sometimes talk about the Star Wars movie where they all were going to get pushed out into outer space because the garbage compactor was going to squish Princess Leia. But, the internet is like outer space. You are going to run into garbage, and there is no, filter on a Google search until the person using Google decides we need to start filtering these responses. So, I agree. And when I do searches, a lot of times one of the easiest ways to filter is to make sure your information is current.
Yes, absolutely. And, I'm trying to stay off Facebook lately because a lot of information that is being shared is not accurate, at least as far as my Facebook friends, people I'm friends with. But I've noticed that they're sharing a lot of junk, and it's older stuff too. Like they'll share an article from like 1997, and I'm like, what does that have to do with right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, and, especially when it comes to images and how images are being used inaccurately. And, fortunately, because some of those have geotags, it's possible to do some source checking and make sure that what you're looking at is, something that's accurate and worth passing along. And I think all too often, it's so easy to share on digital sources that you just push that little up arrow and it tells you what platform you want to share it with. And I think because there's so much, we all feel like we are, validating what we know because we're pushing out this information when in fact we really need to exercise a certain amount of scrutiny before we start sharing on especially on social media. It's just too
Absolutely.
easy to push it out onto our different platforms. Let's talk about the organization process of curating, because once you have found these sources, these resources, we now need something of a digital warehouse. We need some place to put these, to scaffold these resources in such a way that it makes sense to the recipient, whether it's your fellow school librarians or your students or your teachers or your parents.
How we organize the resources that we're curating is very important. I would say it's almost as important as the gathering the sources in the first place. We want to make sure they're organized, easy to use. If it's not organized, if it's a hot mess, like who's even going to take it seriously, And I've found, so over the years, I've used several different resources. I've used Padlet, Pearl Tree, Scoop It, Symbaloo, even S'more, the newsletter I've used that to curate some resources. Lately, I've been completely obsessed with Wakelet because there's so much you can do. And it's a completely free curation tool. And I kind of say it's like Pinterest on steroids for educators. And I like it because of its organizational abilities. You can have unlimited boards, unlimited collections. It's free. But you can also organize your boards by categories. So you can have categories for teachers, categories for your PLN, for your students. It's so easy to organize. And you can add pretty much anything to it. Tweets, Flipgrid shorts, PDFs, images. If you can upload it or it has a URL, you can add it to Wakelet. So that's been my favorite tool, just really for the organization aspect that it offers as a curation tool.
Sure. And I think we can agree that the sort of what you see is what you get. You want to be able to have something that visually appeals to your recipients as well. And I like that when you look at a Wakelet board, you have an idea of what you're going to be accessing, a little thumbnail. You have an idea of what you're going to be opening up. For anyone who's wondering, if somebody clicks on a Wakelet board, do they already need to have a Wakelet account active?
You do not. You can click on it and view it as a guest, and you do not have to have your own account. And in fact, they just did an update a week or two ago where they made it accessible with a code so that students can even add to it without having to have their accounts because of age limits and things like that. So you can even add to boards, and besides just viewing it without even having an account, your own personal account.
Awesome. Can I just ask, can students in your school, the 5th and 6th grade, access Wakelet?
You have to be 13 or older to access Wakelet. Yeah. So they can contribute and they can view it. They just can't create their own account.
Got it. All right. That's excellent to know. I know people are thinking about how we can start using these when we are teaching, especially in a virtual mode. So I'd love to hear, you do have a great resource here. And friends, it's an Amanda Jones episode, so you know the show notes are going to be amazing. They are going to be curated, and they are going to be fantastic. So if you wanted to do a deep dive into curating, Amanda Jones has made it possible. Tell us about this webinar you did with Heather White.
So a friend of mine, a good friend of mine who is she was a 5th grade teacher in my district. Now she actually got hired to work at our central office. I'm so excited for her as a technology director. But she and I, we put on webinars called Our 2 Cents. It's something we started right when school buildings closed in March because a lot of teachers and librarians were wanting to learn about ed tech. And so I said, well, no one's offering it in my area, so we'll just offer it for them. So we started our own series. I think we've had 18 webinars at this point. But I do have, we did one specifically on Wakelet. We've actually done it twice because we did it for an organization. So we do have 2 of them. And it goes through step by step how to start it, how to make your own, all the tools involved, how you can use it with students. So if anybody's interested in Wakelet, we do have that. We share our presentation and we share our webinar video.
I think that's, just selfishly, that's it, because all too often I'll see somebody's presentation and I'll sort of give my own narration, but it's not the same. It's not the same as somebody talking you through their what they put together and the thinking behind it. So friends, this is going to be a great episode for you to visit our show notes. And, the nice thing is that every time Amanda Jones does something, she shares it. And if you don't see it on our show notes, she will be including her school website. And her school website is chock full of resources, which it just is a treasure trove. After we've selected the information, after we've organized the information, I think the third part of curation is this sort of dissemination process or this distribution process. So could you walk us through how once you've put together these resources, how you've chosen to then disseminate it to your intended audiences?
So what I like to do is if it's a resource for students or teachers, I definitely am going to embed it into my library's website. And the good thing about Wakelet is that they give you an embed code, so you can embed it directly into your school website, or you can share it as a link. So sometimes I'll post on the website, click here for resources on such and such, or I'll do an embedded board. So I will embed the codes into my website. So I have on my website, which is lomlibrary.org, there's a teacher resource link. And currently I have 12 different Wakelet boards embedded on the teacher resource page. And those are all resources that my teachers requested. As of right now, they mostly involve technology, Google Classroom, tips and tricks, Flipgrid, Wakelet, Zoom tips, things like that. And each board one board might contain 8 resources. Like my Zoom board is small, but then I have a Google training board that has 56 resources in it. And it's all different platforms, different G Suite basics and things for them to kind of go through at their own pace if they need to learn something. So I do have 12 boards. I also embed a student board. of resources. I recently embedded a Wakelet. Our public library offers free resources. Every student has an e-card. So I embedded a Wakelet board in our student resource section on how to access their e-card, how to utilize it, and then it has all of the resources, the ebooks platforms that they can access. So I do that also. And what I'm really proud of right now, I did a parent one. So this is my first parent. I mean, I always give out information to parents, but this is the first time I created an actual curation board specifically for parents. So I have one. It's called the Live Oak Middle School Parent Resource for 2020-2021. And inside it, I have included all of the Google Classroom codes, remind codes for teachers, teacher emails for the parents to look up, tutorials on how they can use Google Classroom, virtual tours of our school, pretty much one-stop shop. And I advertised that. I actually posted it on social media the other day. It's had thousands of hits so far. So I'm really excited about that particular curation that I've been doing for parents.
Well, and I think what's fun is, and I know there are other people out there who agree, looking at how each of us organizes our library websites is very telling of the thought processes that go into how we organize this information, because we want to make it as accessible and as just logical in how the information has been organized, the drop downs, the links, so I do think from an organizational perspective, what's fun is a lot of times people post on library Facebook, hey, can I see what your webpage looks like? Can I just see what your webpage looks like? Because obviously many of those sort of school-based resources are going to be pertinent really just to your school, but it gives librarians, who are oftentimes the place where people would consider asking these questions first, it gives us, oh, wow, I should incorporate that kind of section into my library. Or I like how Amanda organized her website this way. It makes so much sense. And I think that I know before I interview people, I usually ask to see your library webpage, because it gives me great ideas of how you have chosen to provide this kind of information to your intended audiences. So I really appreciate it. It's a great resource. This may be incredibly obvious to everybody else, but a school librarian's role as a curator is vastly different from that of a classroom teacher's.
I feel like we're a little better trained. Now, we just discussed that we might not have been trained in college, but I feel like through conferences and PLNs and discussion, I feel like we're a little better equipped with evaluating sources, not all the time. I just know that the teachers at my school don't always have a chance to learn about evaluating resources, and I do, because that's part of my job. So I think that they're generally focused on the needs of their students that are just in their classroom, whereas librarians, we're focused on the needs of all the students in the school, plus the teachers, plus the parents, everyone. So we're kind of looking at the needs of the community. And also, I think we're a little bit better trained, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Well, and I think that we are in such a habit of curating. We do it just by nature. I know that it's not unusual for somebody doing I'll use a Google search as an example, that they pick the first hit that they get and they're done. And as a librarian, I'll admit, if I do a Google search, I'm going to spend a lot of time. I want at least 10 or 15 destinations before I then whittle it down to the, say, 5 I'm going to use. But I certainly am not going to pick from the top of the list or the promoted, results that come up when we do searches in general. And I really do think that librarians tend to gather from a much larger pool of information, just because by nature we do thrive on the search for information. So I think that we tend to, draw from a much larger source of information before we start paring it down to what we're then going to share out. Do you think our role as curators, and you've hinted about this, has changed since the pandemic? Because before the pandemic and our distance learning began, My role as curator was really just pulling together resources for research and, like you said, bringing back resources from like a conference. A teacher going to a conference would pull together information that they and their team would use. I think about going to our ISTE affiliates. And when I've gone to our ISTE affiliate conferences in Michigan, it's called McCall, I know I was like panicked trying to get to as many sessions as possible. And one of my friends is like, what's the big deal? And I'm like, do you realize I have a responsibility to my building that if I'm coming to this conference, I've got to have stuff that I can share with everybody. And even if I don't teach science, I'm going to be building that collection in my library. Even if I don't, teach second grade, there are some resources here that I'll use when I teach those second graders that I can hopefully share with my second grade teachers. So, I mean, for me, it seems like that role has really changed.
I think I was, like you said, we were already sort of gathering resources for assignments and things like that, and from conferences. And I did curate those. I think I went into super curation mode the minute we got our school buildings closed. But I realized how important my role as curator is, and not just for my students or not just for the teachers on assignments that we're working on and when we're collaborating, but also I saw a need for the community as a whole. People needed resources, like our parents right now need resources on how to help them with the virtual learning. And so that's not something I would have thought of, curating resources for parents per se. And it also made me realize I really needed to step up my game. I don't just need to curate resources for that one lesson, for that one teacher. I need to have a constant board and things that teachers can access constantly for their subjects, not just for one assignment, for throughout the year.
Oh, absolutely. There is so much about this past April that was just one day merging into the next. But what I do remember is this sort of incessant flood of resources. And somebody described it as a data dump, because it seemed like I was drowning in all this information and almost being assaulted with it every day. I'd open up my emails like, oh, here are these resources and here are these resources. And I had to recognize that on some level, my parents didn't want to see all of that.
I kind of felt like it was that episode on Oprah when she was giving away cars. And she was like, and you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. I felt like I was so guilty of doing that to the parents. Here's a resource, and here's a resource. I'm so guilty of doing that data dump. I did that. And I remember there was a meme on I think it was the Future Ready Librarians Facebook group, and Katie Pyers, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and I don't know her, but she's a librarian in the group, and she posted a meme. She created a meme that said, school librarians, if I can just save all the learn at home resources, the world will be saved. And I really felt like I stopped and I was like, I know I feel that way and I need to calm it down a notch, because I was really guilty of throwing all those resources out like that.
Well, and I think what you and I both can relate to is how excited we get when we find something worth sharing. We want to send it out to people right away. And I remember feeling that, and I have a Remind, which I use for my lower elementary kids, because we have an A day, B day, C day, D day. So when it's A day, I send out a 6:30 a.m. remind, hey, everybody, it's library day. And by the way, Reminds is fantastic, but parents have to opt in. But I was using it because I could reach about 175 of my families. And it was very tempting to just fire off a Remind and say, take a look at this and take a look at this. And you and I can appreciate, especially when we couldn't, I think for me, during the early days of the pandemic, not being able to share print materials, because for the first time in my life as an educator, we were limited in what we could share with our students to strictly being digital. And as librarians, we're so accustomed to filling our children's arms with books and take this book, take this book, take this book. And you just feel like heroes. And now all of a sudden, the way we support people are through digital resources.
Yes. I have a pretty big social media following in my community. And so when I started putting out resources, at first it was kind of business as usual, but I had one that went viral and it was shared over 3,000 times. And it was a source. And it was the same source I'd seen everywhere. I don't know why mine went, I guess because I made it pretty in a Canva. But it was a Scholastic free resource, and it reached 500,000 people, 3,000 shares. And I think that did something to me where I'm like, I've got to keep sharing. I've got to keep on. I've got to keep on. And it's kind of ridiculous. So I really did slow down, though, after I saw that meme. I thought, too much of a good thing. And I think it was my friend Tiffany Whitehead had said, you can share too much. So that really, I had to put everything into perspective and really think about that.
Well, and I think there's something to be said, especially when we are working with our teachers specifically, that you want to give them a reason to open your emails. And, I'm incredibly sensitive to this because I've always been part of multiple buildings, and I get a fair share of just garbage in my email because it has nothing to do with me. So I think especially when I'm sending out resources to my teachers, I want to make sure that they have a reason to open that email. And I'm going to make that as specific as possible because I'll bring it down to the grade level. I'll bring it down to the subject matter. I'll send it out to just one teacher if I think this is the thing that will help you do your job. And I think that goes into how we build relationships, because I think we have to be very restrained in our enthusiasm if it means that our emails will have a better chance of being read.
Exactly. And I think that at first I was just sharing what I thought they needed, and I had to stop myself. And then I surveyed them and I said, what do you need? And so I had to really look at what they needed. And some of them needed Google tips and some of them needed research tips. And so I was able to just email certain groups who needed certain things instead of sending out those mass emails.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think, again, that goes specifically to how we're building those relationships with the teachers. And obviously that takes time. That takes time,
Yes.
and certainly not something that's expected of all, librarians when you hit the ground running in your very first library. As we've said earlier in the episode, when we curate resources, it's not just for our own use and for the teachers in our building, but we're also oftentimes sharing support information with our parents and helping them help their students and our students who had zero access to print resources for months. Now, it seems like the platform that we share these resources is going to depend on our intended audience. Now, can you share with us what you think works best for you?
So I think, and you have to look at your stakeholders. So as far as for my parents, because I use Wakelet for pretty much everything. So then I have to decide to get it to my parents. The best route is probably going to be social media. The best route for students will be on my website, and I can send the links to the teachers that can drop them in their Google Classrooms or send them out on Remind if they feel that's something that needs to go out and Remind. For teachers at my school, that would be email. But also, again, I have the website, teacher resources for them also. I think it just depends. I know that I've been looking at different ways to curate different resources. The other day, we just got a new state superintendent of education. If you knew our old one, you'd know, or this new one is fabulous, and we are very excited. And he actually hosted a Twitter chat the other day. And so I curated all of the tweets into a Wakelet because I know not everybody in my district is on Twitter. So I curated all the tweets so they could read what he was saying, and I sent it out to my teachers in an email, and then I sent it out to the librarians in my state on our Facebook group. So it kind of depends on what you're sharing and who you're looking at. If it's your PLN, definitely Twitter. I share out links on Twitter all the time. The other day, Dr. Carla Hayden, our Librarian of Congress, she was watching Hamilton. She announced, I'm going to watch Hamilton at such and such time on this date, and I'm going to tweet primary source documents from the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress and the New York Public Library. And so, like, as every certain scene hit and people were watching along with her, she'd pop into Twitter, she'd put a primary source document. And I thought that was the coolest thing. And I thought someone needs to curate this. And so I created a Wakelet board for social studies teachers or librarians who are teaching about primary documents as a way to curate all those resources that she was sharing. And I think I just shared that out on Twitter and on social media. I didn't embed that on my website or anything like that.
Well, and I know also a lot of librarians who have used some sort of digital newsletter, like some more, or creating some sort of newsletter that is itself a curation of resources for that time, if it's a weekly newsletter or if it's a monthly newsletter. So I know that newsletters have, you have to be careful, because you want to make sure that when parents get emails from you, that they're more likely to open them, because when they have in the past, the resources have all been relevant and, of a high enough value that they feel, oh, this is, I'm going to open this up because it's been sent to me by my child's librarian. So
I've also noticed, Amy, they tend to open it more if it's pretty. And so if you can throw in, like, make a little Canva promo or jazz up your Wakelet or whatever, I notice I get more hits on things that are prettier.
Well, and I think we're just visually tuned in. And so, when something is animated and it's something, and you're right, just an email out to your families is not going to get nearly the attention than if you if you jazz it up a little bit. And I know that was a trick you shared with us very early on in our social media episode. I agree, and especially if you're doing this on not a daily basis, you're doing this on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis, because again, you want to give your audience a reason to open up what you're getting. And if you're sending them something every day, it loses the specialness of what's being sent out. Amanda, I'm so appreciative, because I got to tell you, our job as curators is not going away anytime soon. And whether you are starting virtually, or you are starting in a hybrid situation, or you are in IRL, our role as curators is only becoming more and more valued as we move further and further into this sort of strangeness that is the pandemic. So please, I can't imagine there is anybody left in our listening audience who isn't following you, but could you please remind our listeners where they can find you on social media? And friends, I will say for the umpteenth time, do check the show notes, because Amanda always gives us great resources we can go and check.
Well, if you're on Facebook, you can find my library. It's LOM, as in Live Oak Middle, LOM Library. If you're on Instagram, it's LOM_library. If you're on Twitter, it's at LO Middle Library. Now, I have a professional Twitter account where I share resources, and that is at ABMACK33. And that's also my Wakelet handle. So if anybody ever wanted to check out my Wakelet boards, it's at ABMACK33 on Wakelet also.
Amanda Jones, I am so grateful that you have given us a little piece of your afternoon. Friends, Amanda Jones is going to work tomorrow. Your school year starts tomorrow, and I got to tell you, I felt so bad when you told me, you're like, oh, it's my last day to sleep in. I'm like, what?
No, Amy, I will talk to you anytime you ever want to, night or day.
Well, friends, I'll tell you what, we're going to give Amanda a little bit of time to get her school year situated. I wish you the very best of luck when you are back at school. And friends, trust me, take a look at all of the resources Amanda has shared with us over the past season of episodes. You won't be disappointed. Amanda, best of luck with you. Stay well.
You too, and thank you for having me.
was thrilled and delighted that Amanda could join us during this incredibly busy time of the school year. And I want to encourage you to please be sure to check out the show notes for a very well curated list of resources. If you found today's episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. The topic of our next episode will be Virtual Makerspace and my interview with Amy Rubin. I hope you will tune in.